I think what's also interesting is particularly entertainment or music that becomes an area of identity contestation between Taiwan and China. Because China is so much larger than Taiwan, just the music market is so much larger. And so entertainers such as Wang Leehom, for example, will go to China and make their living there, and that affects the views that they espouse. And then there's concern from some people that the next generation of young people, for example, will grow up in an environment in which just it's dominated by Chinese music, television, film, and so they'll always be thinking of China, the greater China, it's this bigger, better place because the production quality is usually higher.
Brian Hu is the founder of New Bloom, based in Taipei, Taiwan, and is also a DJ. He's going to be taking us on a journey of Taiwanese culture and politics through 5 songs, which were released over the course of 2021. Brian, take us away.
Yeah, so the first song is Sorry No Youth by Sorry Youth. Sorry Youth is one of the best known indie rock bands currently. They often sing in Taiwanese Hokkien. And so, yeah, we'll listen to the song and talk a bit about it after.
So Brian, what's remarkable about this band and what they're all about?
So I think what's interesting about Sorry Youth is they're kind of a voice of a generation. This is very much the generation that came of age around the time of the 2014 Sun Farm that involved the month-long occupation of the Taiwanese legislature by student activists in protest of a trade deal with China. And so Sorry Youth is one of these bands that kind of played at every protest, and they've been at sort of every protest in the years since then. They're very closely tied to activists. A lot of their songs kind of reflect how I think a lot of acts are thinking, feeling, a sense of kind of disenfranchisement, of being displaced, trying to seek out, just a place of belonging, etc. I mean, it's sometimes criticized. I think a lot of these kind of indie rock bands are very masculine. The one that is probably the kind of flagship one is Fire X, which also sings the Taiwanese Hokkien and sang at Tsai Ing-wen, the Taiwanese president's inauguration, for example. Tsai rode to power after the Sun Farm. But Sorry Youth is kind of a more indie-ish, I guess, so they haven't become as close to political power. The thing is that they actually don't produce that much songs, though. I think the members have other lives and are busy, and now some of them have kids. And so kind of what this song is reflecting on is that maybe they're no longer young people, despite youth being in the name of the band. And so that's why it's called Sorry No Youth, because the Sun Farm movement was, after all, 7 years ago. Some of their songs are reflecting on, just for example, this young generation that had, no job opportunities, were facing low salaries, unaffordable real estate. Well, they've grown up and had kids, better for better or worse. So I think this is kind of reflecting on that.
Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of indie music in Taiwan and how it's sort of kind of ebbed and flowed in interests and bands over the years?
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think there's a very solid kind of indie scene now. People that listen to bands, indie rock bands, there's so many that it's a subculture of such size, for example, they could say an entire dating app based on this app and the subculture. And there is actually such an app. And so I find that kind of remarkable.
What's it called?
It's called Xingjiao. I forgot the English is Heartings. I think the Heartings is...
Oh, Chinese is fine.
Yeah, I think Hearting is something like that in English. But then it's interesting that because then one of the functions of this is you can find friends to go to events with. Things like that. People go to festivals, venues, they have their favorite bands, and people are sometimes very auditory of their favorite bands. But there's many ways in which I think, particularly after 2014, for example, views of young people shifted. Before that, young people were seen as weak and soft, etc. But suddenly there's a view of them as a generation that's willing to take risks to secure their own futures. And in line with this shift in perception, you have the much more attention being paid to indie rock from the mainstream in that sense. So there are much more indie rock bands. I think that, for example, some bands are actually pretty mainstream, but they package themselves as indie. It's become this kind of aesthetic. And so indie is now mainstream in that sense. At the same time, for example, I don't think the music industry is really large enough that people have bands where they can make their living off of it. That's very, very rare, unless you do actually break out to the mainstream in some form. And so I think that's one of the paradoxes, that you have a lot of these people that are in bands, but they also have day jobs, and they struggle with having kids now. Just historically, if you're serving in the military, that also disrupts your bands, for example, just mandatory draft. And so a lot of bands dissolve. Yeah.
So a lot of bands started, dissolve.
Yes, because they're interrupted by the military service. And so then now, as this generation gets older, then you also have, for example, those people have kids and being too busy to record and release albums and that. And, they talk about their fans too, because I think there are a lot of fans that just go to basically like every show, that sort of thing, and are know quite well the band members. So that's one of those things.
I can imagine like that year and a half or so where Taiwan had no COVID and no one could leave. Like, did people get sick of seeing the same bands over and over again? Was it kind of fun? What was the live music scene like in that time?
Yeah, so it's actually quite interesting because I think this affects some scenes that way, because you do have, for example, bands or local bands. You can only have local bands. So then that's a way to censor local bands. You can only see live music from local bands now. For example, in the electronic music scene, then you only have local DJs. You don't have foreign DJs coming in. But I think then at the same time, putting international artists in dialogue with Taiwanese artists can sometimes be a real stimulus to the scene. And so this was something I was lacking past 2 years, that, you don't have artists coming in with different styles or different influences and building ties with Taiwanese artists, for example, as much. And this was something that had been before COVID. And so I think then that whenever, particularly because I'm more into, personally as a DJ, into the electronic music scene, this was very interesting when an artist will come in representing someone's style that is not as present in Taiwan. And then that'll kind of influence people, and people try to, kind of change up their work, perhaps being influenced by it, etc. So as they build networks or ties with artists, and so the collaboration will continue. That hasn't happened as much now. It can still happen, but it's through the internet, for example. And so, some of the MVs that you do see these days, or some of the songs you see, are still co-productions However, just it is not, it's kind of different than in the past. The other thing though is the indie scene, despite the fact that it is quote unquote the new mainstream, as I mentioned earlier, it's still quite small, that there are only so many venues that exist in Taiwan. And so a band that has performed and become successful, for example, may have played at basically literally every venue in Taiwan. So, that's another thing that's a little paradoxical. It's the indie scene is a strange kind of awkward position in which it's become much larger, but it's not large enough to sustain artists on their own, and there are only so many venues because it is difficult to run venues, etc. I just think that there's only so much maxed out space in terms of doing venues, which are oftentimes not too legally supported. There's not a support from the government in terms of the relevant laws or finances, etc. You have neighbors complaining because of the noise, or they just see kids and they're scared, and that sort of thing.
Sure. Let's come to our next song, Brian.
Yeah. So the next song is Talakoa by Collage. And so this is a very late release because it's in December, right before the year ends. And so that's a bit of a surprise, a nice surprise to have a release from them right before the year ended.
And what kind of music do they make?
Yeah, so they're more kind of indie rockish, but they incorporate a lot of influences. And I think that is quite interesting. Just that they have linguistically, they have anything from Taiwanese Hokkien to Mandarin songs and also Japanese songs. Some instrumentation too is citational in that sense, just quoting in some sense other forms of music. And I think, that's reflective of in their band name of Collage. So I think what's particularly interesting about collage is that, for example, the lead singer is Amis, indigenous Amis. And so she is very concerned with her heritage. Her master's thesis on the preservation of indigenous culture, or more precisely, the curation of how indigenous culture was depicted during the Japanese colonial period. As in terms of, for example, just depicting Japanese colonialism as a civilizing mission and indigenous customs as sort of backwards and in the past, but also representing some of the prehistory of, let's say, Asia, at a time in which Japan was on this imperial project of conquest, of forming the greater East Asia Coast Prosperity Sphere. And so this is quite interesting that way. I think that the lead singers also express enthusiasm for Japanese culture in terms of, for example, the costumes they were performing, or even the artwork of the album covers. That is something that she draws herself, despite being so critical of, for example, Japanese colonialism. I mean, being someone of Indian descent, that meant that your family was on the receiving end of the brutalities of Japanese colonialism. So I think what is interesting then about the band is that it reflects in many ways this kind of cultural pluralism that one sees in Taiwan today, that just there are so many different influences kind of coming together and compressed together, oftentimes in this family background of somebody, but also in these various cultural influences. But then you have all these different overlapping colonialisms. At the same time, just all these irreconcilable political viewpoints sometimes. For example, being a indigenous person that is descended from a family that was that went through the Japanese colonial period, but also being interested in Japanese anime or Japanese culture or music and that sort of thing.
It's a tricky tangle of thorns to navigate, I imagine, but also makes for cool music.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite interesting seeing bands grapple with this, because I think particularly interesting is developments in indigenous music in the past 2 years as well. Indigenous musicians have traditionally been slotted or positioned as singer-songwriters, as folk. And I think this reflects views of indigenous music or of indigenous people that, this is folk. It's kind of something of the past, and their music is like that. And oftentimes it is, singing traditional melodies paired with guitar, for example. Part of it also is influenced by just the 1960s and global folk movement in terms of just the interest in getting away from, let's say, capitalism and etc., and returning to something kind of more in touch with nature, etc. And I think indigenous customs that are framed as part of that. There was a campus folk movement, for example, in Taiwan, and just then you do have indigenous singer-songwriters coming out of that. But then in more recent years, you see acts such as boxing, hip-hop, for example, or outlet drift, which is indie rock, or even Jungi Sapor, who's Amis as well, and is a DJ. So moving to electronic music, or someone like Abao, who's also a kind of singer-songwriter. Some of her stuff is also kind of electronic-ish, so it's more singing over that. Covered up.
Can we do an Apao song, Brian? She's my girl.
Oh yeah. The funny thing is, the past year actually there was actually comparatively less releases, which made creating this was a bit of a challenge. I think it's because of the 6-month break in which there was COVID basically from May until, let's say, October-ish. So I think that interfered with the out of release. Comparatively, I did see less releases this year compared to a lot of other years. So yeah, this song, it's Takudan with its collaboration with DJ Didi Long and Abao. It's interesting because this song is another example of these kind of overlapping influences, for example. This is actually a version of a traditional song about kind of forbidden love between an indigenous woman and a Han man. And so this is a modern day hip hop reinterpretation of that. And Didi Long, who is, of course, Han, plays the Han man. Abao plays the indigenous woman. And so this kind of reversion of it is very interesting, using, contemporary melodies of taking traditional songs and putting them in a kind of a new form. And it's very contemporary. And the music video just is, just there was like a fleeting counter. I feel like this is kind of a genre of Taiwanese music video, which is like, oh, boy meets girl, and they somehow just exchange glances and nothing more comes out of that. And that's such a common, trope of music videos. This is one of that, but I quite like it. I think the interesting is quite interesting combining these musical forms. It is one of these songs that combines a more melodic, for example, song, which is by Abao singing here with hip hop intertwined with that, which is Didi Long. Didi Long is also someone that, for example, sings in Taiwanese Hokkien, or raps in that. We started off a little more kind of experimental, for example, doing collecting sounds and then making music out of that, sound samples, but then kind of drifted more towards hip hop and had mainstream appeal by really leveraging on this sense of Taiwaneseness. I think around like 2016, which in the years after the Sun Parliament, things that really emphasized Taiwaneseness in music tended to be very popular. And so, you have these bands such as Sorry Youth or Fire Axe or etc. that kind of rose out of this environment or atmosphere as well.
我想要送予你上水的花，情话无法度藏在心内底。你爱知影，咱的缘分是天早就注定好势，不是，像伊讲的安尼，袂予你伤心。我是你唯一的选择，请你唔好顾虑这多。
沙巴初春听暖风，嘛乌噜了沙乌巴路，嘛努比嘛苏，嘛努比嘛苏。
不知影啥物叫做丁马苏，只知影为你饲袂规个人忙叔叔。这句答应，你不答应，这句答应，
这句答应，台湾人，这句答应，
这句答应，你不答应，这句答应。虽然讲我的爸爸妈妈讲你好你好，你的爸爸妈妈讲加白加白，我陪你一起回老家了解了解。和我亲爱的爸爸一样，我有问过你的朋友，要去拜访的礼物，爱吃槟榔甲烧酒。啊对啦，煞袂记你爸爸是恁送辈，也是我爸啦，我嘛会当传规管的保佑。
And I think you probably already, unless, is there anything more you want to say about that song? I feel like you gave it pretty good.
Not particularly, yeah. But something that was very cool is that Abao came to Taiwan and collaborated with your mom. So I was one of the people I recommend Abao as someone to collaborate with, main to the production team. Yeah.
So let's turn now to Sonia Calico.
Yeah, so Sonia Calico is one of the up and coming and pretty known producers at this point in time in terms of the underground music scene in Taipei, Taiwan. That's something I'm kind of connected to myself. I DJ, though not very much. And so I tend to listen to a combination of indie rock and underground electronic music. And so Sonia Calico's out of the kind of milieu. I mean, she's been doing things for a while. For example, even in around 2014, there was a album of artists that were involved in the anti-nuclear movement. That was one of the protests that was very big in the year before the Sunflower Movement, and there's a lot of youth participation. And so she has a song on there, actually. That's something I play periodically. It's very different from what she's doing now. It is more kind of club music, very strong kind of beats, etc. It's not the mainstream EDM kind of ish club. It's much more, let's say, alternative or independent or underground, different sets of aesthetics here. So I think this particular video is interesting as a kind of collaboration with Korean artists.
So Brian, thinking about collaborations, sort of U.S. Taiwan, Japan Taiwan, Korea Taiwan, China Taiwan, Southeast Asia Taiwan. Where is the most activity, and what are the trends?
So that's actually part of why I chose this, because it's quite interesting that you have a kind of underground artist collaborating with a Korean artist, because that's actually what you see kind of most recently. For example, Murky Ghost, who's a rapper, a female rapper, was also collaborating with Korean artists. And suddenly there's a strong interest in Korean music in Taiwan. I think just because it's in line with global trends. I mean, there's a lot of interest in Korean culture, whether that's with Squid Games or Parasite or what have you, or Korean fashion, or groups such as BTS or Twice, etc. But it's kind of interesting in that sense, because Taiwan has such strong historical ties with Japan. And even though the song we listened to from Collage, I mean, this Collage is a band that also is interested in these kind of Japanese influences. But then in terms of actual collaborations, you don't see that as much. For example, Taiwanese artists collaborating with Japanese artists. I kind of wonder what that is, actually. It's interesting that these ties between Korean artists, particularly from the kind of underground scene, and Taiwanese artists developed, particularly during COVID, actually. I think part of that is because, particularly in terms of the genre of underground electronic music, Korea has a very developed scene. So I think reaching out to Taipei might not be out of the question in that sense.
Hi there, Callum Quinn, China Talks editor here. Jordan's sick this week for the second week running, so I'm going to take a few seconds to plug the China Talks Substack. It's Jordan's birthday coming up on April 10th, and I know that what he wants more than anything else in this world is to get 10,000 subscribers on the China Talks Substack. We're currently at 9,396, so we're really close. If you listen to this podcast, you'll like the newsletter. It's full of interesting articles, guest posts from people working in the China space, transcripts of interviews, and translations of cool Chinese language stuff. It's free to sign up, and the link is in the show notes.
So, Brian, speaking of cross-cultural things, the drama of Wang Leehom and his divorce, I think we can fit in that bucket to make a somewhat smooth transition. Give folks who've never heard of this news story a bit of a backgrounder, as well as elucidate some of the broader societal issues which the story and the treatment of it in the press has elucidated.
Yeah, so Wang Leehom, the Taiwanese-American superstar, came under scrutiny during his divorce to his wife, Di Jinglei, who's not a public figure. But then she alleged infidelity on the part of him a few days after their divorce. And just this history of sleeping with women, acting that he was still single, sleeping with sex workers, etc. And this was posted on her Instagram. And so this went viral. This took place right before the voting on the national referendum. And so it suddenly just overshadowed the national referendum in the news, who was so focused on this. People were so focused on the drama between them, in which one of them would post something and then the other would respond. Usually it would happen sometimes, just like, one goes to sleep and just suddenly wake up in the dead of night and post something. And then just will have more content in the morning. And so people were kind of still churning over this. And it just went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. It was a dominant story. But it raised these issues regarding, for example, abuse of women. That took place not too long after an incident in which a female legislator, for example, was beaten by her boyfriend. So even a very powerful woman in a position of political power could suffer abuse in this way. And that highlighted these issues. There's a lot of concern with how women are treated by the media or focused in on by entertainment gossip. And so this highlighted a lot of those issues. But it just kind of takes more turns and twists as time goes on. And the latest thing I heard was that Wang Leehom is like hanging out with gangsters. And this was another element in their divorce. That was as of yesterday. And so it is one of those things. I mean, it's fodder for the tabloid media for sure. But it's just interesting because particularly Wang Leehom is someone that built up a credibility as a musician on the basis of being Taiwanese American, for example. This cultural capital of being from the U.S. He's one of a number of musicians for that period that was like this. LA Boy is another. Someone like DJ Jerry is another. And so a lot of the kind of, kids that are around my age grew up listening to this music and then suddenly watching their kind of idol just shatter and be taken down from that throne in front of their eyes. That's something I think people are very focused on.
And give folks a sense of like how big he is in terms of, I mean, more salient than I think Justin Timberlake, which is like the closest person I can come up with as like a somewhat squeaky clean but also enormous male superstar. I don't know. What do you think there's an analogy in the US? I'm not entirely sure.
I think it's a good analogy.
Yeah. And the sort of dynamic of the parents getting into it as well. Good. We're not going to play one of Wang Leehom songs because he is a dirtbag. But let's turn instead to No Nonsense Collective. Why'd you choose this group?
Yeah,
Brian?
so I think though critically in terms of trends in Taiwanese indie music, you have the kind of harder sound sometimes. I think this is represented by No Nonsense Collective. This isn't full, heavy metal or not Freddie Lin, the Legislators, death metal, etc. But it's a kind of harder rock sound. I think this is something that's quite appealing to a lot of people at this.
So what about their politics is interesting?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because a lot of the bands I brought up, for example, a lot of their the way they come known is actually very tied to politics. No Nonsense Collective, they're people that are part of heavy metal bands, for example, and collectives of heavy metal bands that were involved in the Sunfire movement. They were actually there's a group, I translate it as kind of subaltern liberation area or pariahs liberation area, sort of splinter group from the main group in the legislature during the movement of artists, heavy metal musicians, people more kind of politically radical leanings. And so they were kind of from that milieu or that environment. And so a lot of these bands kind of just went through different lifetimes, because I think the thing in Taiwanese bands is that they don't usually last more than 2 years. They disintegrate because of all these factors I mentioned, or family or doing military service, etc. But then the same musicians come back together in other forms, creating new groupings or bands down the line. And so No Nonsense Collective comes out of that kind of milieu of like zine production. They run a kind of space, an alternative space, or let's say some cultural space, somewhere in New Taipei, if I recall correctly. They're part of a group that does this kind of annual party, which is bands get together as well as DJs in Xinzhuang, if I recall correctly. I have no sense of direction, so I don't remember I got there last time. And just, it's like a day-long thing. And so they come out of this kind of more countercultural orientation, I guess you would say, but they still found mainstream success in a way that really did surprise me. When they go on tour, it sold out very quickly. They play all the big venues, etc. I didn't really expect a band that was from this kind of background to actually become so successful. That's quite interesting to me, actually.
Brian, is there a right-wing band we can highlight? What is right-wing music?
That's a good question. So I feel like the indie rock scene, or the indie scene in general, let's say, is pretty progressive. That's how I describe its politics. No Non-Select is more far left, actually, I would say. But you do have Xiaomi, the tankie rapper. It's kind of interesting. I mean, I've fought with him on Twitter before, more than once, because he's on Twitter. He's one of the people that does idealize China as just a socialist utopia, and he's also quite fond of North Korea as well. He went to North Korea and filmed the video. He's kind of an interesting character because I actually feel like that he could play actually a few years ago, and then, he was still someone that people were like, oh, this politics is weird, but there's still room for him to play. I don't know necessarily if that's the case now. I feel like there's a political mood has shifted. It's not to say this is good or bad or anything. He's an interesting character.
Is there a song which you find tolerable?
Not particularly, but I do find the one where he goes to North Korea quite interesting, because it is actually a little daring. I mean, to actually go to North Korea and sell music that potentially would have gotten in trouble. But he does lay it on a bit much with the kind of socialist realist aesthetics in terms of the MV. I don't know how people feel about that. Yeah, the funny thing is that I actually do feel that he has gotten better over time, in the sense that his skill has actually improved. I do think he's a much better songwriter than he is a performer himself. I mean, I recall seeing other people perform songs he had written, and I thought they were not actually too bad. So despite fighting with him all the time, I do have some positive things to say about him.
Yo, red salute to ransom notes. This is for the people. Fuck the U.S. of America. 谁是朋友，谁是敌人？我们能否追究这问题而不自欺欺人？谁的盟友，谁的利润？是谁基于一份而争斗和牺牲？谁是朋友，谁是敌人？我们能否追究这问题而不自欺欺人？谁的盟友，谁的利润？是谁基于一份而争斗和牺牲？饶舌的激进分子被说是愤世，我只想引人深思和去伪存世，因为从小到大有太多虚伪人士灌输错误认识，使人愚昧无知的无视显而易见的压迫和暴行，使人固执己见，失去批判思考力。一旦遇到陌生的意见，认知就失调，变本加厉的延伸原本的错误视角，成为了心理防御机制，也使我们无意识的成为压迫自己的体制的棋子。即使我们自以为自己是正义的意识，但其实是我们迷失于断章取义的历史，而敌视并歧视被压迫的各国人民，自以为仁义，却把压迫者奉若神明。不分明侵略和防御，只要求无条件的和平，得到奴隶主的肯定，不我不被他们尊敬。谁是朋友，谁是敌人？我们能否追究这问题而不自欺欺人？谁的盟友，谁的利润？是谁基于一份而争斗和牺牲？谁是朋友，谁是敌人？我们能否追究这问题而不自欺欺人？谁的盟友，谁的利润？是谁基于一份而争斗和牺牲？检举率最高的国家被当作自由象征，最常推翻民选政府的他被当作挚友良朋。我们只有盲人摸象般称颂，或便是偏执的不见识，骗子掩饰的现实。别人饥饿，我们说是领导人无人性，却不记得制裁的目的是经过饿死人民，破坏稳定，以迫使革命群众放弃革命。如果这不是恐怖主义，那么你的定义肯定有问题。我问你，唯一动用核武器的到底是谁？为何朝鲜发展核武就被认为是罪？谁的奴性思维被支配的颠倒是非？是我们把自卫视为威胁，把威胁视为慈悲？是谁不知不觉的在重复戈佩尔所起草的流言蜚语的同时，说别人被洗脑，并对用着坚如铁的毅力英勇的起义驱逐侵略者的人民无理的怀有敌意？谁是朋友，谁是敌人？我们能否追究这问题而不自欺欺人？谁的盟友，谁的利润？是谁基于一份而争斗和牺牲？
Brian, do you have a sense of like what a, I don't know, 50-year-old like KMT supporter, like what is their like sonic ecosystem?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess they do listen to these kind of national anthems. That is something probably, I don't know if they listen to it at home, but it's something that, you know, inspires pride. They also often do listen to older Chinese music, you know, like Teresa Tang, like that maybe, or also Taiwanese music from that period. Just I think a lot of it's quite retro. And so it's kind of it's one of those things. I think just sometimes, for example, I live in a very old neighborhood, and just my neighbors will just be blasting, you know, just like old Taiwanese songs, etc. So I think that is one of those things. They're kind of in a bit of a time warp. But I think what's also interesting is particularly entertainment or music that becomes an area of identity contestation between Taiwan and China, because China is so much larger than Taiwan. Just the music market is so much larger, and so entertainers such as Wang Leehom, for example, will go to China and make their living there, and that affects the views that they espouse. And then there's concern from some people that the next generation of young people, for example, will grow up in an environment in which just it's dominated by Chinese music, television, film, and so they'll always be thinking of China, the greater China, as this bigger, better place because the production quality is usually higher. And so a lot of even the indie bands will be reluctant to voice their own political opinions, which generally do slant towards Taiwanese independence or at least, you know, being free of China in some form, because of the fact that they still tour in China. And so it's so difficult to make a living as a young person, particularly a young person doing music. And so touring in China is a way to make more money to survive off of and continue doing what you want to do. And so it's why they're not as open about these views. I mean, Sorry Youth is quite open about their views, so I think there's that. But particularly, for example, No Nonsense Collective, they, because of their more left-wing stances, they will express solidarity, for example, with Chinese groups. Particularly, for example, with Wuhan affected by the coronavirus as the origin. They did a zine, if I recall correctly, just to kind of reach out because the punk scene is quite strong in Wuhan. And so they try to offer support or solidarity in that way.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty tricky / nigh impossible line to toe. Like, is there, you know, there was a moment in mainland, I don't know if you're the right person to ask this, but like, you know, there was a moment in mainland China where like Taiwanese music was seen as particularly cool and special and like, you know, forward. And, you know, there was certainly a generation, you know, Wang Leehom included that, like, you know, the predominance of like megastars on the mainland were actually Taiwanese, not from mainland China. It seems like that is changing. But I'm curious for your take on how sort of Taiwanese artists are starting to be, you know, how the reception of Taiwanese artists on the mainland has changed over time.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things. I think that in the beginning, it does have to do with perception of Taiwan as exotic other in China, you know, as a place that is different. And you can just trace that all the way back to Teresa Tech, for example, etc., as this kind of forbidden musical idol that sing different styles, etc. But then in the 1990s and 2000s, as Taiwan and China become more economically interlinked, I think that also plays into the economy. In terms of the economy of the music industry, particularly. For example, just in terms of the fact that a lot of factories have Taiwanese owners and a lot of the capital is coming from Taiwan, then in terms of these more established artists going over to China as having more capital or clout, etc., I think that reflects the era that things have changed now in terms of the relation between Taiwan and China economically and politically and also culturally. And the cultural aspect reflects the other too in that sense. So I think you do have much more Chinese artists that are known in Taiwan. Taiwan, think of itself as small. The entertainment industry is dwarfed by China. These historical dramas, for example, of like ancient Chinese history, the ones that are produced in China now have much bigger budgets than the ones produced in Taiwan, and so they usually are of higher quality in that sense. And so that's something that's changed. We always have people talking about these variety shows, the Chinese variety shows that you have Taiwanese contestants going over and to participate in it. And just so Taiwan is then framed as part of this greater, you know, network of provinces in which you have all these different talents and so forth. But once in a while, I have a Taiwanese judge or what have you.
Okay, next up we have Rainbow Chan.
Yeah, so this is quite different. This is also more reflective of my taste in that it is more kind of underground, etc. There's a kind of pop melody, so Stanley. And this is not from Taiwan, but it's from Hong Kong in a sense. Rainbow Chan is Hong Kong, Australian. From Hong Kong, but grew up in Australia. so I find the song interesting because of concerns regarding Hong Kong and Taiwan in the past few years after the 2019 protests. So this is an album by Rainbow Chan reflecting on the changes that Hong Kong has gone through from a position of diaspora in the sense that the city's gone through so many changes, and uses romantic love as a metaphor for that. And the songs on the album Stanley are a combination of Cantonese and English and some Mandarin, if I recall correctly. And so I think it's quite interesting, particularly because of the fact that Rainbow, when I interviewed her not too long ago, said that Taiwan was one of the bigger places which was interested in her music. And so I think what's quite interesting then is thinking about the role Taiwan has geopolitically, but also then regarding these larger events in the region, such as the protests in Hong Kong. After that, there's been a migration of Hong Kongers to Taiwan. You have a lot of Hong Kong restaurants opening up, or bookstores or things like that. And you haven't really had musicians yet, but I think that this will affect cultural production in the future. And I think that's interesting because we talked a bit about the views of Taiwan in China, but thinking about the views of Taiwan in Hong Kong and the views of Hong Kong in Taiwan, it is quite interesting because I think what led to the sense of solidarity that one sees between Taiwanese and Hong Kongers in the past, let's say, decade is that they grew up consuming each other's culture. And so particularly back then, before the rise of China, Taiwanese kind of music industry or film industry was more established and sent to China, but also Hong Kong. Hong Kong films were also quite established, and you would have people in Taiwan watching Hong Kong films or listening to Fei Wang and things like that. And that kind of era has really faded, but I think people are still quite remembering of that. And I think that just then with the wave of Hong Kong migration to Taiwan, eventually this is going to have cultural effects, which I think we'll see down the line in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years. But I think this will be an interesting development to watch in terms of, say, Taiwanese indie music or these various scenes. We'll have artists, for example, that are political in Hong Kong, perhaps not having the ability to stay there anymore and coming to Taiwan and perhaps bringing their talents here. And that will affect things, perhaps.
Cool. Thanks so much for all this, Brian. Should we do a Teresa Tung like outro song?
Sure, why not?
Or all right, why don't you pick one?
I don't know. I actually don't. I mean, The Room Represents My Heart. That's a classic.
All right, sounds good. Okay, that was so much fun.
你问我爱你有多深，我爱你有几分？我的情也真，我的爱也真，月亮代表我的心。你问我爱你有多深，我爱你有几分？我的情不移，我的爱不变，月亮代表我的心。轻轻的一个吻，已经打动我的心。深深的一段情，叫我思念到如今。你问我爱你有多深，我爱你有几分？你去想一想，你去看一看，月亮代表我的心。打动我的心，深深的一段情，叫我思念到如今。你问我爱你有多深，我爱你有几 去想一想，你去看一看，月亮代表我的心。你去想一想，你去看一看，月亮